Welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm Henry Adams and I'm joined by Enrique Alvarado from Washington State University. And today we'll be giving an introduction to Morse theory. Our outline, I'll start off by giving an overview of Morse theory, the big picture. And then Enrique will describe CW complexes. I'll describe the Morse lemma. And then we'll go into the two main theorems of Morse theory, theorem 1 and 2. And we'll end by describing the resulting Morse complex that you get out and the more refined Morse-Smale complex. And we'll end with a couple of slides on the TTK software that allows you to compute some of this data and smooth it. This is part of an NSF-funded grant, Delta, Descriptors of Energy Landscapes Using Topological Analysis. So this webinar is, for chemists and mathematicians to speak with each other. And today it's more the math crowd speaking to the chemist crowd, but please interrupt with any, any questions that you have as we go. All right, so let me give you a high level view of Morse theory. This is a screenshot of the TTK software package. TTK stands for the Topology Toolkit. It's very nice software. You see here we have this real valued function defined on the square. And in green, white, and blue, we have identified the local maxima, saddle points, and minima of this function. This function is actually rougher than it looks in this picture. If we labeled all of the local maxima, saddle points, and minima, we would have a much more complicated picture. But Morse theory allows you to do some smoothing operations, as we'll describe at the end, to smooth down the critical points that you have into a picture that really gives you an idea of the more global behavior of the function. If you've heard of persistent homology before, there's actually a persistence diagram in the bottom right image of this plot. And that sometimes is used to aid simplifications. So Morse theory is what allows us to to produce the cellular model with vertices, edges, cells. So the main idea of Morse theory is you have some space. Before it was a square. Here in this picture, our space is a torus. And that space is equipped with a real value function. So before it was that wavy surface over the square. Here the real valued function we'll just use as the height function on the torus. And when we combine together the Morse lemma and the first two Morse theorems, it allows you to conclude that your space, in this picture the torus, is the same shape as a cell complex. And in your cell complex you have vertices, edges, and two cells, etc. Furthermore, we can say how many cells you have of which dimensions. So on the left, we have various critical points of height. P1, P2, P3, and P4 are our critical points of the height function. When you're nearby one of these critical points, if you move in your space, your height is changing with a derivative of 0. And these critical points have indices associated to them. The index of a critical point, roughly speaking, is the number of linearly independent directions in which you can move, in which the function of interest, height, decreases. So P1 is a critical point of index 0. P2 and P3 are both critical points of index 1. From those points, there's roughly one direction you can move where the function or the height decreases. P4 is a critical point of index 2. There's a two-dimensional space of directions in which you can move away from P4 and the height decreases. And what this corresponds to on the right is we're building up this space by taking a vertex, gluing on an edge, gluing on a second edge, and then finally gluing on a two cell, corresponding to the indices of the critical points that we've passed, P1, P2, P3, and P4. So as we sweep the space from bottom to top, at first the sublevel set just looks like a bowl on the bottom right, and that's homotopy equivalent to a point. Once you cross P2, your sublevel set is homotopy equivalent to this macaroni noodle, and that's the same shape as taking your disk and gluing on an edge, the edge corresponding to the critical point P2 of index 1. Then as you pass P3, you get this next sublevel set, And again, you've drawn on up to deforming the space. You've attached one more edge. And finally, when you pass P4, you've glued on this two-dimensional cap at the top. So that is a high-level overview of Morse theory. In chemistry, you might have heard of the nudged elastic band method before. This is a way to find index 1 critical points. Roughly speaking, this minimum energy path is one of these edges corresponding to an index 1 critical point. So here on the right, in nudged elastic band, we've let our band flow until now it passes through an index 1 critical point. I'll pass over now to Enrique, who will describe CW complexes for us. So what's the CW complexes in code, how you glue together cells to get interesting spaces. So.
Yeah, so if we think back to our torus example, there's a lot of different ways that you can represent a torus in a discrete way so that computers will understand. So in order to represent it discretely, you want to know what the building blocks are. So the building blocks to these CW complexes, the way that you could describe a torus discretely is by having different cells. So the 0 cell is just, you can think of as a vertex. The 1 cell you can think of as being an edge. 2 cell is a disk, and a 3 cell is like a solid ball. Okay, so these, you can have 4 cells, 5 cells, so and so on. So these CW complexes are built up inductively. So you first just think about first placing down your vertices, and then taking your 1 cells, and with the boundaries of each of these 1 cells. So in the case of a 1 cell, the boundary of it is just the 2 endpoints that are vertices. You glue the boundaries into the 0 cells that you have already placed down, and then once you place all these 1 cells, you glue all the 2 cells into what you already have placed. So you do this inductively. So in the next slide, we have our first example. So let's say the first thing that you do is place all your vertices. You can see it as called the 0 skeleton on the left. And then you place all your edges, or all your 1 cells. So one thing to notice is that these edges, they don't necessarily have to be straight line segments. They can be curved. They can wiggle around in any way that you want them to. But the only requirement is that the boundaries of the 1 cells get attached to what you had in the past. Okay, so if you want to place your 2 cells now, you can the boundary of a 2 cell is a circle, and you can just fill in the head of the stick figure guy by gluing the boundary along the circle that's defined by the head. Okay. Next slide. So one more example. The previous example was just in a plane. So let's say you have vertices in 3 dimensions, and then you can attach 1 cells on the figure that you have in the bottom left here, and then you can attach the 2 cells, and in a similar way as how we did before, as you can see on the bottom right figure, on the left semicircle, that's 1 2 cell attached to it. Another 2 cell attached is the triangle in the middle. But then you can also attach 2 cells. So you have your sphere, or your disk, and you can collapse the disk, the circle, or the boundary of the disk, into 1 vertex there. And so that sphere that you have is actually a 2 cell, where the boundary of that 2 cell is collapsed onto that 1 vertex there. So you have a lot of freedom as to how you're as to how you're gluing things together. Okay. So, like kind of what was mentioned before, there's a lot of different ways that you can describe manifold-like objects as CW complexes. So if you have your torus, you can describe it as a CW complex with 100 vertices, 100 edges, and 100 two cells, which are the triangles on the left. Or you could describe it in a completely different way. If you could just have one vertex, you could have two one cells or two edges in the blue and the green there, and you could have one two cell. So you have a plethora of ways that you can describe these manifold-like objects. And the nice thing about Morse theory is that the function that the real value function that you have defined everywhere on this manifold is the thing that tells you what cells you're gonna be using. Okay.
Fantastic. In particular, in chemistry applications, the real valued function might be the energy, and you're using the energy landscape to decompose the manifold into this cell complex. Okay, so Morse theory is classically defined in the setting of manifolds, these very smooth spaces, and a smooth function f from your space, your manifold, to the real numbers is said to be a Morse function if all of its critical points, the spots where the derivative is 0, are non-degenerate. So on the left, we have an example of a non-degenerate saddle point. On the right, we have an example of a degenerate monkey saddle. So the technical definition of non-degenerate is that you look at this Hessian matrix of second derivatives as drawn on the left, and then you are a non-degenerate critical point if this Hessian matrix has non-zero determinant. That's a little bit more detail than we'll be getting into today. One comment, however, is that Morse functions are dense in the set of all smooth functions. So any function that you might have, if it's not Morse, you can perturb it ever so slightly and it becomes a Morse function. So you're really not losing much often by modeling any function just by a nearby Morse function. In particular, the drawing on the right is a the drawing on the left is a discretized picture of showing how if you take this monkey saddle and you perturb it slightly, it breaks into two normal saddles. So on the left, on the top, we have a monkey saddle. The pink regions are the regions where our function is decreasing. It's called a monkey saddle because the saddle has room not only for the two legs of the monkey, but also for the monkey's tail. And then on the left, on the bottom, we see how we can perturb this function just a little bit in this discretized context. And the monkey saddle, the vertex in the middle, splits into two saddles that are standard saddles with two regions that are decreasing on either side of the standard saddles, one for each leg. There are more complicated critical points, such as a swallowtail. And here you might not want to use Morse theory to study those, but instead catastrophe theory. But that's a topic for another webinar. We're going to build up now to the Morse lemma and the first two Morse theorems. So these are the driving forces behind Morse theory. So the Morse lemma says that if your critical point is non-degenerate, then locally you can represent your function in this chart where it looks like some number of directions where the function is decreasing, this negative x1 squared up through negative xi squared. And then you have another sequence of directions, xi plus 1 squared up to xm squared, where the function is increasing. So in this picture on the left, this is a function defined on 2D. We have one direction in which the function is decreasing, one direction in which the function is increasing. So I, in this picture, would be 1. Yeah, and so the Morse lemma says you could always write any non-degenerate critical point locally like this. And this is how you define the number of quote unquote linearly independent decreasing dimensions. And that's defined to be the index of this critical point. So here we have one linearly independent direction in which the function is decreasing. So the index of this critical point is 1. Here's a picture where it's a critical point at the bottom of this parabola, but in both directions in which you could move, the function is increasing. So here the index is 0. There's no linearly independent directions in which the function is decreasing. By contrast, in 2D, a local maxima is a critical point of index 2. There's 2 linearly independent directions in which you could move away from the peak of this mountain. And in both of those directions, the function's getting smaller. So this is a function where in coordinates, it would be negative x1 squared minus x2 squared. This one would be x1 squared plus x2 squared. And this one would be negative x1 squared plus x2 squared. So the first Morse lemma is a characterization of these critical points, and it also allows us to define the index of any critical point. We've just now visualized saddle points in 2D. Here's a nice picture of a saddle point on the top left. On the top right, we look at the saddle point from above, and we see that the topographic map has this X in it. Where we're going to move next is we're going to try to visualize saddle points in 3D, which is a little bit harder. So let me try to describe saddle points in 2D from the perspective that we'll be able to describe also saddle points in 3D. So as you're standing at the saddle point, pretend we're flooding the landscape with water. So global warming is fully upon us, and the landscape is being flooded with water. If you're standing at this index 1 saddle point, you could ask, when the water touches your toes, how does it hit you? And it's in the bottom, it's this pink, these 2 pink regions are how the water hits your toes. You're getting poked by water from both the right and from the left. If you're a minimum, if you're standing at a valley, then as the water sort of approaches you, it really just approaches you from where you are, right? That's where the water collects initially. And if you're at a maximum, if you're standing on the top of a mountain, then as the water approaches you, it surrounds you from all sides. So you can sort of see the index of the critical point, 0, 1, and 2, going from left to right upon the bottom. 0, 1, and 2 are encoding the number of linearly independent directions in which the water is encroaching upon where you're standing as your world is being flooded. A regular point, however, looks like the top left. Water comes from one side, but just washes over you as if it were a wave crashing upon you at the beach. So now in 3D, it's a little harder to visualize things because to visualize a real function on 3D, to visualize its graph, you'd have to be in 4 dimensions, and we can't visualize that. But the pictures of if you were at a critical point or a regular point on the top left, how would the water approach you as the height rises? Those pictures we can still draw. So if you're at a non-critical point, a regular point, as the water level increases, it's the picture on the top left. It just approaches you from one side and washes over you. If you're at a minimum, the water collects exactly where you are first. If you're at an index 1 saddle point in 3D, the water is approaching you from one linearly independent direction, the right and the left. If you're at a saddle point of index 2 in 3D, the water is approaching you from 2 linearly independent directions. The water is approaching you as a circle that's enclosing around you. And if you're at a maximum in 3D, the water is approaching you from 3 linearly independent directions. It's this entire 2-sphere of water that's coming around you prior to getting flooded. So I like these pictures as a way to visualize saddle points in higher dimensions. You see that index 1 saddle points and index 2 saddle points are not the same thing. Any questions about these pictures? Fantastic. I will pass over now to Enrique, who will describe the first Morse theorem.
Okay, so the first Morse theorem. So let's set up the context first. So let's say you have a manifold, and in the picture on the left, you can see that the manifold is just you can think about it as the square, the XY axis, just a little portion of it, and you have a function in our chemistry applications, the energy value along every point on the XY axis. And you have the graph of the function is this, I guess, yellow, green, and blue, and purple surface with 3 critical points. There's 2 local minima. There's 2 index 0 critical points, and there's 1 index 1 critical point, 1 saddle. And the saddle is the value of the saddle is labeled in green. So, okay, so what the first Morse theorem tells us is that if your level set, so take if the sublevel set, so take a particular z value, and you look at all the points in the manifold, in the rectangle in this case, which are below or at that z value. If you're between any 2 critical points, changing that z value in between any 2 critical points won't change the shape of it. In particular, both of those sublevel sets will be homotopy equivalent, you say. So let's start with let's say z equals 0, and that's the very bottom of the energy. So as we raise that z value, the sublevel set becomes the small disk right here. There's the blue, and then the outer edges are yellow. So all of that you can contract into a single point. And so then you'd say that sublevel set is homotopy equivalent to a single point. So as we increase our z value, or our a, then it's going to hit the second index 2 critical point. And at this point, we're going to have two disconnected sublevel sets. Okay. One of them coming from the first critical point and the other one coming from the second critical point. But these are two disconnected points because you can contract each of those disks to single points. And having 1 point is not homotopy equivalent to having 2 points. As you increase the sublevel set, as you increase the A for your sublevel set even more, then you hit the index 1 critical point, and you get this, I'm not sure, a peanut-shaped region of the plane. And that you can think about, that's the same thing as taking your 2 previous critical points and attaching a 1 cell or an edge to those 2 critical points. But you can see you can just contract that 1 edge and it's homotopy equivalent to that single point. Okay. Okay, but only these homotopy changes only came from once you pass those critical points. In between, everything stays the same. Okay.
Fantastic. So Enrique has given a good setup to describe Morse theorem 2. Morse theorem 1 said that between critical points, the shape of the sublevel set didn't change. But furthermore, when you pass a critical point, the shape changes by attaching a single cell of that dimension. So as Enrique swept the sublevel set threshold up, he first passed this critical point of index 0, added a vertex, a 0-dimensional thing. He then passed this next critical point of index 0, added another 0-dimensional cell, and then finally passed this critical point of index 1, adding a 1-dimensional cell, an edge. Here's another version of this. So we have our torus again with the height function. Our critical points are P1, P2, P3, and P4. They have index 0, 1, 1, and 2 because they're minima saddle point, and maxima. And as you can see that as we sweep the height up, our sublevel sets look like this disk, and then the macaroni, and then almost a complete torus, and then finally a torus. And to get from one sublevel set to the next, after passing a critical point of the various indices, you glue on a cell of that dimension. So if I take this disk and glue on a one cell, corresponding to the index 1 critical point P2, I get a shape that's the same as the macaroni, the next sublevel set. And then to this macaroni, if I add another one cell corresponding to the index 1 saddle point P3, I get this nearly formed torus, almost all the way there. And then if I take this sublevel set and attach a 2 cell corresponding to the critical point P4 of index 2, then I get the final sublevel set, which is in the entire torus. It's sort of said that it's illegal to describe Morse theory without giving this example. You'll see that we ended up with a complex with a single vertex, 2 edges, and a single 2 cell. This was the minimal cellular decomposition of the torus that Enrique showed on an earlier slide. Okay, so we're building into Morse complexes, which Enrique will tell us about. Very briefly, you see that the entire space is the same as a CW complex with one cell of dimension I for each critical point of index I. And great. This is the picture here where we've decomposed our torus into a single vertex, 2 edges, B and C, and then a single 2 cell, D. So in the picture on the right, this is indeed a torus if you identify the right and left edge together to get a cylinder, and then identify the top and bottom edge to get a torus. So Enrique will now describe Morse complexes in more detail for us.
Okay, so going back to the energy surface example that we have with the two index 0 critical points and then single index 1 critical point. So let's see what the Morse complex looks like in this case. So one thing that we need for the real value function to satisfy is that the gradient of this function needs to be something that's called Morse-Smale, and what that means is that the unstable and stable manifolds of the critical points are transverse. Okay, probably won't say exactly what that means, but if you look at these integral curves, if you place a point down on the xy plane and you let that point flow along the force that's defined by the negative of the gradient, there's certain trajectories that this point takes, and the stable trajectories of each of the critical points and the unstable trajectories for each of the critical points, these have to intersect one another transversely. They can't intersect tangentially. Okay, so what do you do first? First, you compute the negative gradient field on your xy plane, and that's what's shown in red. And what the Morse complex is that you take the unstable manifolds of your critical points, starting from the index 0 critical points, growing up to the index, well, whatever you have critical points. In this case, we just have index 1. So on the next slide, let's draw those here. So, okay, so we have the critical points, the 3 critical points that we have. The circles are the index 0s. So those are the ones that we start with first. And the triangle is the index 1 guy. So the stable, so if we take a look at the first critical point on the next slide, the stable manifold of this particular critical point is everything that's inside this rectangular region in blue. So if you plop a point in this blue region, that's going to flow towards that particular critical point. Okay, that's the stable manifold of that critical point. Now the unstable manifold is actually just the critical point itself. Okay, so in the next slide, we do the same thing. The stable manifold is everything that's in that blue rectangular region, but the unstable one was actually the same critical point. And so we have the unstable manifolds for the two index 0 critical points are just the critical points themselves. So now if we go up to the next index critical point, which is the saddle point, we take a look, okay, what's the stable manifold for that critical point? It's everything that's along the blue line, and the unstable is everything that's along the red line. Okay, so the nice thing is that as we go up in index, taking the unstable manifolds is like attaching a one cell in this particular case to the previous unstable manifolds. So in the next slide, we have the unstable manifolds of those of critical points of index 0, and then in the next slide we have then this one we have the unstable manifold for the critical point of index 1. And that's like attaching a one cell to the previous 0 cells, which represented the unstable manifolds of the other critical points. Okay, I think that's it for this slide.
Fantastic. So Enrique has described the Morse complex on the left. We're also going to mention the Morse-Smale complex. So the Morse-Smale complex, think of it as a subdivision of the Morse complex. It's going to be the Morse complex, except the cells are going to be further divided. Roughly speaking, what we're going to do is we're going to take the Morse complex of the function, and then we're going to also take the Morse complex of the negative of the function, and we're going to intersect them. So in the Morse complex, we have our local minima in white, our saddle points that have 2 colors, and our local maxima in blue. And the ascending manifold around any critical point is Enrique, that's what you called the unstable manifold. Is that right? No. Yeah.
I think this is the stable.
This is the stable. Okay, you're right. Yeah, the ascending manifold. Yeah, this is the this is the stable region. So the orange points are all the points that are flowing into that local minimum.
Mm-hmm.
The descending manifold is all the points that would flow out of that extrema. So the descending manifold of this blue local maxima is the region drawn in green, because that's all the points that you can get to by flowing out of the peak of this mountain. But now, instead of having these as our cells, we're going to intersect ascending manifolds with descending manifolds. You intersect them to get this region in red. So this is going to be one of our cells in the Morse-Smale complex. We've subdivided things further. Okay, we're not just taking the cells in the Morse complex, nor the cells in the negative of the Morse complex. We're intersecting them to get a little bit more information. So regions will decompose as drawn here. The region denoted V contains all those points who, if they flowed uphill, they'd get to the maximum in red on the left. And if they flowed downhill, they'd get to the maximum in blue on the right. These points W, if they flowed downhill, they'd get to the same minimum. But if they flowed uphill, they'd get to a different maximum. And so we're just decomposing our space into these regions where inside a region, you flow up to the same extrema and you flow down to the same extrema. These regions are often, they're always squares, but these squares can be identified with each other in certain ways. So parts of a square could be pasted together. In 3D, these regions in the Morse-Smale complex are cubes, as drawn on the bottom right. Again, however, these cubes could be, different edges on this cube could be glued and identified with itself. I should point out that these slides I'm using right now are by Guangning Chen at the University of Houston. He has some very nice publicly available teaching materials on his webpage that I encourage you to check out. So one idea of Morse theory is that if you have nearby critical points, you might want to try to simplify them to simplify your representation of the function. So in slide B here, you see that we have nearby minima and maxima of this function that perhaps you'd like to be able to identify those as being nearby and then perturb the function only a little bit to cancel them, getting a reduced representation of your function that still has most of the data you're interested in. You can do this for functions defined not only on 1D, but also on 2D. So here, U is a maxima, L is a nearby saddle point, and we can cancel those to get a simpler function with fewer cells. Here's a more complicated picture. We have two peaks with a saddle in between, and we can cancel the saddle with the closest peak to get a simpler representation. This gets more interesting when you can do it computationally, do it in software package. So you have a real valued function defined on the statue on the left, and you can see there's a lot of different saddle points of all different indices in blue, red, yellow. But if you simplify it down, on the right, you get a much simpler representation of the critical points of this function.
Do you happen to know what function they use here?
I do not. That's a good question. It probably is not height, right? Well, maybe, but it could be something like distance to a fixed point. But we'd have to go check out this paper cited down below.
Yeah,
it's a good question. Let me give you some more examples, some of which are chemically inspired. So this is a picture of the van der Waals potential. So on the left is a drawing of this function with colors illustrating the height, I believe. And in the middle is your first Morse-Smale complex. So you're encoding all of the critical points. And then on the right, we've simplified it down a little bit more. So we've gone from 564 critical points down to only 166, which are representing the most important topological, the most persistent topological attributes of this surface. Here are two examples from material science. I think you can see the atoms arranged out in these lattice type structures in these pictures. And for the silicon example on the top, it's hard to figure out what's going on with all those critical points and all the minimum energy paths in green, particularly connecting them. Whereas on the right, we've simplified it down quite a bit, many fewer extrema. You can get quite nice visualizations. Again, we're simplifying as we go from the left into the right. All those green minimal energy paths on the left, many of them disappear in the picture on the right. The Topology Toolkit, or TTK software, is fantastic for this. So this is one of the slides we showed at the very beginning. Our function is rough, and if you looked at all the extrema of the function, you would have many green maxima and many white saddle points. But you can simplify this down to leave only the most important ones. And in the TTK software package, the significance of a critical point is measured using persistent homology, which perhaps you've heard of before. Thank you very much for your time and attention. We just have a couple concluding remarks. So you should think of Morse theory as a way to provide a condensed cellular model representing the sublevel sets of your function. And the further point is that your function might have some noise in it, but nearby critical points can be canceled to get a simpler representation. If you're watching this video, you've heard of the Applied Algebraic Topology Research Network, but other places you could find more information about applied topology include the Geotop A online seminar, which is another online seminar, and appliedtopology.org is a great place for announcements of conferences and opportunities. The two most common mailing lists in this field are WinCompTop and AlgTopL, so I encourage you to check out those as well. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and we appreciate you joining in. Thanks.